While our colleagues here get wired up and prepared for this panel, which is going to focus on the Middle East, and we're going to do this panel on the Middle East, and then we're going to do a panel on Atlantic issues, and then we're going to have a terrific panel on Pacific issues prior to the arrival of Secretary Kerry. I want to do two things, one of which you expect, the other we don't. And that is, first of all, this is the newly redesigned homepage of Foreign Policy, which I encourage you to go and look at and explore as you will. And I just want to point out that down here you'll see in breaking news, because we have breaking news that we're covering, you have a headline, Obama advisor, extremism could be key to ending the Syrian issue, posted on our Passport blog 45 minutes ago. And you can't tell, but that's a lovely picture of Tony Blinken and someone else. I don't like that other picture, but you know, what the hell. But the point is, it happened here, it went through our reporters, and now it's up there and on the internet for everybody to see. So, you know, news is happening here and around us. We've got a great panel, and I'm going to, of course, we'll do 7 questions before the panel, but let me introduce them. Noura Al-Kabi is the CEO of 2454, the leading media organization in the UAE, and is one of our leading global thinkers, and was the most successful one of our leading global thinkers with the Rubik's Cube, as far as I could tell. Jim Jeffries, who was, as noted earlier, our ambassador to Iraq, had a very distinguished career, including serving as Deputy U.S. National Security Advisor. And Derek Chalet was originally on this panel, and his plane had trouble, and Jim was standing out there, and his wife was saying that he has to walk the dog. And I said, well, would you like to do this instead? So, I mean, you may have a dog's discomfort on your conscience, but we do have Jim, and I'm grateful for that. Vali Nasser is a well-known commentator, runs Johns Hopkins SAIS, and beside Vali is Ann Patterson, who recently was our ambassador to Egypt and is now the Assistant Secretary with the responsibility for this for this entire region, which is, you know, as you will see at the end of this job, at the end of this conversation, quite a job. And beside them is my colleague and friend Noah Shachtman, who is the executive editor for News and is really the guy responsible for the picture of Tony Blinken going from there and up onto that site so very quickly, and he leads our news gathering organization, and Noah will moderate this first part of the conversation among them. But as we have before, let's switch over to the questions, and those of you on the panel can get a sense of what the group feels on a few core questions about the Middle East. So if we could make the switch. Over the course of the next decade, the U.S. is likely to grow, A, more deeply drawn into the greater Middle East, whether we like it or not, B, less involved in the greater Middle East, deferring more to other powers and institutions, or C, frustrated by our inability to change our level of involvement in the region, which is likely to remain about the same as it is today. So A, B, or C. We've got 7 of these again, something like that, and we'll go through them, and then we'll go to the panel. But panelists, I encourage you to take a look. And I think that's a very interesting, telling, and probably accurate answer. Frustrated by our inability to change our level of involvement in the region, which is likely to remain about the same as it is today. Next question. So, the country that is the highest priority in the Middle East and should be the U.S.'s diplomatic and political priority is Syria, Israel-Palestine, which I would say is not one country, but it's something, not quite 2 countries yet, but we're on our way. Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, they cannot be separated and must be addressed as part of a cohesive grand strategy, or other. Azerbaijan. And that's roughly where I sort of thought it was going to come out. A group of people seeing the pieces fitting together, and one above them all, Iran, coming in second. Next question. So, following the Arab Spring and its ripple effects, the greatest cross-cutting challenge facing nations in the Middle East is economic development, political participation, combating terrorism and extremism, gender equity and minority inclusion, or other. And so 44% say economic development, which is extremely important. 11% say gender equity. 20% say political participation. Quite interesting. We focus so much on the security issues, and it's the underlying issues that this group, many of whom are experts in this area, feel are key. Grassroots challenges to autocratic or dictatorial rule are A, a fundamental shift requiring new strategies for effective foreign policy engagement, or a limited phenomenon. In other words, is what we've seen over the past couple of years something that's likely to be short-lived, or is this something that's going to change the nature of the region on a long-term basis? Okay, and look, there's no hesitation here. I've always, in groups like this, worry about certainty, but 95% of you think this is a fundamental and irreversible shift. Next. I think the most likely outcome of the interim nuclear deal with Iran is A, more participatory and constructive role for Iran in the Middle East engagement. B, a more emboldened Iran and less stable Middle East. C, fracturing of US alliances, particularly with Israel. Or D, and you could throw in the Gulf, or other. So 47% said more constructive role for Iran in Middle East engagement, which is a rather large group. 12% said other, so there were a couple of you who said other. Who said other? Surely, yes. I didn't say anything, I guess. You say other every time. I admire your consistency.
I think a constructive role for Iran, but it's not necessarily more active engagement.
Okay. A constructive role. Here comes another vote for other, right to your table. Okay, anybody else say other who wants to chime in with why they said other? Okay, how many more do we have? What? 2 more. Okay, 2 more. Given rising global supplies of oil and natural gas from non-OPEC countries, the cartel is likely to A, fracture with individual nations pursuing their own agendas, B, cooperate and maintain major influence over global oil prices, or C, other. And that's a kind of non-committal. One side says fracture, the other says cooperate. Seems kind of binary, but 7% of you said other. Who said other? Well, Bob Hormats, why did you say other?
I said other because I think they'll cooperate, but they'll have less.
Okay. So they'll continue to cooperate, but their influence will fade somewhat. Okay. Anybody else say other that wants to? Yes. You don't like the choices. Thank you. Thank you. That's just the kind of cooperative outlook we're looking for. For those of you, we'll later have a question whether you like the food. Over the next 5 years, drones will A, becoming increasingly critical to the US security position, B, fuel greater tension in the Middle East, C, become commonplace when Amazon adopts drones as its delivery system. I don't know why we've just faded to this, but let's not do that. Wow. Wow. I don't know whether to react to the even division among you among these choices, one of which wasn't that serious, or B, to react to the fact that the majority of you, or the plurality among you, consider Amazon to be the leading force in drone technology worldwide. All right, Noah, with that semi-humorous answer, why don't I turn the panel over to you, do a couple of rounds of questions, and we'll open it up to the audience.
Okay, got it. So I thought that all those questions kind of got at a larger truth, right, which is the region's in transition, right? And a lot of the sort of old ideas about what we had about the region are kind of up for grabs, right? And so, whoops. So I feel like, as a interested observer, like that I knew what U.S. foreign policy was about in the region a couple of years ago. I thought I understood its bedrock principles. Kind of maintain stability, keep the oil flowing, partnership with Israel, And now, I'm not sure, I mean, I work at Foreign Policy Magazine, and I'm not sure I know what the bedrock principles of US foreign policy in the Middle East are. So, Anne,
Okay.
can you enlighten me?
Look, there's no question that the challenges and the frustrations have been enormous in the past 2 years, and that is a required American diplomacy and security policy across all agencies to be vastly more nimble and creative than before. But I do think, and we're required to do a number of things simultaneously, but I do think the trajectory of American policy is clear, and as your questions indicate, there's no going back. So we're going to have to deal with this situation going forward for many years. It's to promote democracy, which is going to be enormously difficult. It's to encourage open markets, and I personally think that the economic dimension of this, as Bob Hormats knows only too well, has been underemphasized, because what we have throughout these countries are these enormous youth bulges, angry young men without jobs. We have a situation in which unemployment actually increases with education, because people have invested in higher education, bad higher education, and have no access to the modern labor force. So we need to rethink our economic engagement with these countries, and I think the administration is in the process of doing that. Encourage integration, open our markets, transform our aid programs. There's a lot we can do in this sphere to get at the underlying economic causes.
Got it. And just a quick follow-up, and then I'll get to the rest of the panel. Is promoting democracy really at the center of what we do? I mean, so you're familiar perhaps with this country called Egypt, where they had an elected government, and that elected government got overthrown, and we seem to be, I don't know, kind of okay with that.
We're presented essentially with a fait accompli in Egypt, and we have very significant security interests in Egypt. The Suez Canal, Sinai, overflights, the longstanding peace treaty with Israel. So we have to deal with the world as it is. But yes, fundamentally, across many administrations, promotion of democracy in the Middle East is our policy, because that's the only way these countries will become stable partners and interlocutors.
Vali, in your book, which was amazing, you were very critical of certainly the first Obama administration's approach to the world and to this region, talking about lack of leadership. Has that changed in the last 6 months at all? And I'd also be curious to get your thoughts on the questions I asked Anne as well.
Well, I think a sort of a leitmotif of the first term of Obama administration largely was that this region does not matter to United States foreign policy in the ways in which we had thought, that it doesn't matter to global security in the ways in which we had thought, and we ought to shrink our presence there, not only militarily, but in terms of our diplomatic, economic engagement. I think that is not only a view here, as I articulated in the book. When you go across the region, and even when you go to Asia, and they are looking at our approach to the Middle East, how we went from a huge amount of engagement to essentially giving a message that we are shrinking our presence. I think everybody sees this as a bedrock of Obama administration's policy in the first. Now, what the consequences this has, whether it's a good idea, it's a bad idea, is a different question. But I think so I think it's still there. I think still the administration is beholden to the idea that it wants to do a lot less in the Middle East, that the history of the Middle East is in the hands of the people of the Middle East, whether it's democracy, revolution, upheaval, that we only intervene when there is a major crisis, as it happened in Egypt, in Syria, and that generally we want to pivot towards Asia, whatever we call it, but that our focus is somewhere else, and we think this region matters less to the global economy. To the question you asked of Anne, I think it's always dangerous if we reduce the region entirely to one sort of entry point in analyzing. It's either Arab Spring, or it's either civil war, or either it's youth. In Middle East, actually, one of the scenarios that might happen is that it actually may begin to go, parts of it may begin to go in very different directions. Iran has always been a sui generis country. If there is a deal, or even if there isn't a deal, I think Iran is going to go in a direction different from the Arab world. Turkey, which has been part in the Middle East, part out, is going also in a very different direction. And then if you looked at the Gulf countries, it is very clear that the Gulf countries are much more part of the global conversation about emerging market, growth markets, G20, and the like. And if you look at the things that we want to get involved in other words, putting our stake in the ground in areas of the world where most of the global GDP is through these free trade deals, well, guess what? The Gulf is already part of the Indian Ocean economy. It's already part of the Africa-Asia economy. It's already part of Southeast Asia's story. So this idea of saying, we're going to leave the Middle East going to Asia, I think actually doesn't hold up to the reality that is out there. And partly the reset, I think, is not about that we're going to get engaged everywhere in the Middle East in the same manner as we did. But we have to understand that this is a dynamic region. It's not just about civil war and uprising. There are many other stories there, and parts of it are actually quite successful. And those parts are going to find their own way. And even if you look today, for instance, India and China are a much bigger part of the Gulf economy than we are. Look at the trade numbers with China. Look at the growing energy relations with India and China. And those are the things we have to look at.
Jim, do you agree that the U.S. is kind of retreating in the Middle East? Do you agree with that proposition?
No, I don't. I think that, first of all, President Obama was absolutely correct in his UN General Assembly speech, where, first of all, he spent all 45 minutes talking about the Middle East rather than his reset to Asia or anything else. And secondly, he gave 4 crucial U.S. national security priorities. Our alliance system, the Turkeys, the Israels, the Saudi Arabias, the Egypts, etc. The weapons of mass destruction issue, the terrorism issue, and maintaining the flow of hydrocarbons. I think those are excellent priorities, and I think the administration wants to preserve them. I'll come to whether it's succeeding in a second. The president did talk a good deal about democracy and a bit about economics in the Middle East, but he said something that, from my experience in 3 years trying to do the job in Iraq, echoes loudly, is that we need to be humble, I think that was his word, in how we can affect internal situations. And I think that's nowhere more true than in today's Middle East. And while a democratic, economically flourishing, individual freedom-oriented Middle East would be in everybody's benefit, it's not the Middle East we have today, and we don't have any really good idea how to get there. We do have ideas on how to deal with President Obama's top 4 priorities. The problem many of us outside the administration have is that we're not sure that the administration's position on this is internally coherent. That is, it's hard to, all 4 of these things involve either the use or the threat of the use of force. And if much of your mantra is we're withdrawing we're ending America's wars, we're withdrawing troops from here, there, and everywhere, and sometimes even we're trying to think of rethinking the war on terror, it sends a message to the region that we have these 4 priorities, but we're not sure how we're going to carry them out, so we can continue that later.
Nora, I'll get to you in a second, but and I wanted you to respond to that. These priorities do seem to be in tension, and how do you harmonize them? I mean, it does seem like there is a tension between wanting to withdraw troops and constantly having this heavily armed stick.
Well, let me sort of take issue with this idea of American withdrawal from the Middle East, because if anything, in the past few years, I think we've been, it's not just a question of military power. Secretary Kerry will be here today. And he can talk to this group about his involvement in the Middle East peace process, to which I think he's off again to his 9th visit. And his vision for this, which would be if Israel could trade with all these Arab countries, think how that would be a game changer. We can talk more about that later. The involvement in Syria, the involvement with Iran, these are enormous diplomatic initiatives that the administration has undertaken in this very troubled part of the world. Yes, certainly the administration has pulled back on troop levels to 0 in Iraq. But let's remember what has been achieved so far with the potential elimination of Syrian chemical weapons and the possibilities that have been opened up by this Middle East peace process in which the Secretary is deeply engaged.
Okay, I want to get back to that in a second, but I want to bring Nora into the conversation. Nora, these conflicts that are going on in the Middle East, they affect your business too, right? If there's fighting in Iraq, if there's unrest in Egypt, talk to us about how that affects the kind of work that you're doing.
Well, the difference of what I'm going to add is that the area of our business is where we collaborate more with let's say the American pictures, international pictures that can film in Abu Dhabi, or let's say the affected Syrians who are the second, let's say, one of the second biggest productions in the region. And unfortunately, of what happened, the Syrians wanted to film their drama, and they wanted to continue with what was supposed to be something that is powerful in an economic base and from a cultural perspective as well. So what we've done is, where can we provide a rebate system and incentive to encourage regional and international pictures to come and film in Abu Dhabi? And from that, there was a framework, and there were talent base that we had to tap on. There is a framework with also the government in terms of allowing the number of more than 100 Syrians to fly from Syria to Abu Dhabi to film their drama for 2 months, 30 episodes. And right now they're going to film more dramas in Abu Dhabi as if it was filmed in Syria. And from here is how you can provide opportunities to such countries as such individuals who, unfortunately, from whatever political phase they are in, they're not able to grow or empower their business. So from that, there are 2 dimensions. Dimension number 1 is getting the Syrians or the Egyptians to be part of continuing of doing what they're wanting to do and forming their own culture. And number 2 is also how getting the local talent within the United Arab Emirates and within the Gulf to be part of such cultural mix, to understand their problems, how can we develop them. The more we interact with those people and the more that we work with them as by fact changing the way we develop our media industry and try to reach into a level where we would like to also enable the media sector to be a commercial viable sector and to move away from the major let's say highlights within the region. Is it an oil-rich country? Is it a gas-rich country? Is it a country that is purchasing those number of let's say drones or Amazon or whatever it is? But it's also looking into how those countries are looking into other ways of job creation and diversifying the economy, of enriching their own sense of art and culture and content as well.
So instead of keeping the hydrocarbons flowing, it's keeping the movies and music flowing too.
Yes, keeping the music, I mean, with the sad stories that we see in Syria, or sometimes our Egyptian friends, the number of talents we get from Egypt and other places like Beirut and Jordan makes us, believe that there are opportunities in the region. And unfortunately, the more of what you see, around our news channels, even not just international news channels, as the political disputes and the problems that are happening. Yet again, with a region that has more than 60% of its demographics are youth who are below the age of 25, are within the region, and you're having more than 350 million people speak one language only. I think there's an opportunity that we're missing, and we're focusing on areas of dispute, which is okay. We need to solve such issues again at the same time. Yet again, the way we work with international production is something that we put, let's say the problems on the side and see how we can flourish with what we're doing.
Yeah. And with the demographic and cultural changes that Noor just talked about, there's obviously like a new way the U.S. has to do business, right? And so you see in the Middle East the U.S. experimenting with a lot of different ways to do business, and seeing a lot of change happen at once. And so, I take the years you were in Egypt, where we went from in recent years Mubarak to supporting him to being against him. the Brotherhood taking over, sort of working with them, then kind of supporting, or at least, I think tacitly endorsing a new way. How do we, and it's led to a feeling of ad hocism around the region, that the U.S. isn't necessarily, can't be counted on to do the same thing day to day. And so, talk to me about what we can be counted on and how you did navigate those many changes in Egypt.
Well, I think, it's not fundamentally up to us. It's fundamentally up to them. And I think we, as Jim says, we should approach this with humility, because these changes were all indigenous. And they were provoked, as I say, in my own view, largely economic, by this huge cohort of angry young people demonstrating and looking for better opportunities. But some things I think are constant. I mean, certainly our economic engagement has been constant and in my view should be greatly enhanced. I think our security interests in Egypt are constant, and I think we have acted as if they were constant. I mean, after all, the Camp David Accord is sort of the bedrock of peace in this region. And I think our assistance programs, which have been frankly very transformative in Egypt over the years, were constant, and again need to be increased throughout this region, although that's very difficult in a time of reduced resources. So I think there is a great deal of constancy in our approach to these countries that gets obscured by the political veneer often.
Valerie, do you see that constancy?
Well, we might be ourselves satisfied with what we're doing, but clearly that's not the way people look at our balance sheet. I mean, in reality, we are still engaged in the region. We're still there. We're still doing a great deal, and many things have changed. But the way to think about it is when the degree of engagement we had, say, when at the beginning of the Arab Spring, ought to be compared with the degree of engagement we had with other democratization movements around the world. So when you look at whether the United States took leadership around the world to bring resources to the Middle East at a very critical stage, at the early stage, take a country like Egypt. I mean, since the Arab Spring has happened, the economy in the country has collapsed. Doesn't matter whether under interim government, the Brotherhood, or today under the military. You don't see the level of urgency in the United States to lead the IMF, the European community, other communities, to try to stabilize the Egyptian economy. I mean, we can have all sorts of debates about whether the military is good, the interim government was good, Morsi was good, who dropped the ball. But Egypt is going to continue to sink politically until its economy is stabilized. And there is no sense in the region that the United States has that urgency. In fact, administration officials publicly put it that Egypt is put on the back burner, is no longer even a priority for the United States. That's the quality of a declaration for us. Or you take the case of Syria, there is a sense in the region that the future of that region is being written in Syria. There is a particularly destructive war because of the sectarian element, because that it opens the Pandora's box about borderlines in the region, because what happens in Syria is deeply tied to what will happen in Lebanon and Iraq, and also because of the sheer size of refugees in Syria is a direct threat to the countries around it, and that if Syria blows up in a bad way, in a negative way, we're going to be dealing with that for a very long time. Again, the sense in the region was that even the amount of effort that we put at another time in bringing about the Madrid conference, the amount of diplomatic investment we made in bringing Arab Israelis together was never done. So we ended up with a deal, but we ended up with a deal after we reduced Syria from a major regional issue to an arms control issue. So we have a successful arms control agreement, which some might argue actually as in a de facto way has turned Assad into our partner. So, when people look at that, they say, yes, we snatched something in the region. We snatched a victory, but it does not reflect the sort of ambition that we should have expressed, or at least a sense of worry and urgency that we should have had about Syria. And I think many people think it's still not there. It's still that we are reconciled to letting this conflict sort of run its course, and that we don't really have a game plan for ending it, or we're not setting it right. Now, if there is a logic to what we do, and it's not apparent to anybody in the region, which is actually in some level is the main customer of this policy. I think one big problem is that we're having this debate all the time in Washington. And we get self-satisfied when some arguments or policy positions or explanations are satisfactory here, which is a very important constituency, but it's not really convincing to the people in the region. And I think down the road, that will have credibility issues for the United States.
Jim, you nodded vigorously when Vali said the future of the region's being written in Syria. So I take it to mean you agree with that. I'd like to, that future looks pretty bleak if that's the case. Syria isn't looking terribly great, even though there has been this arms control win, apparently. So talk to me about what was behind that nod.
It looks bleak because the core problem, which is a civil war, and how it's going to turn out has not really been resolved, and we don't really have a clear idea of how it will be resolved. The reason that that's far more important than a civil war someplace in Africa, Central America, or even Yemen is not only the location of Syria, but the issues involved. The first of them, I'll get back to the question you posed to Ann about are we consistent? At some level, the United States is always, I sort of poo-pooed it earlier, but the United States is always going to have to and should be a supporter of democracy and human rights. That's who we are. On the other hand, in the Middle East, unlike my experiences 20 plus years ago in Eastern Europe and later in the Balkans, promoting democracy doesn't ensure that the other laundry list of key strategic issues, like the 4 that President Obama talked about at the UN General Assembly, are going to be achieved. What we've seen in Iraq with the Maliki government, in Gaza, in Egypt with the Muslim Brothers, and 6 months ago I wouldn't have said that, but to some degree I have to say in Turkey with Erdogan, is moderate or somewhat Islamic movements that we thought we could work with to some degree, with perhaps the exception of Hamas, taking the country in directions that may not be too good for not only our strategic policies, but for the long-term promotion of democracy. So we see internal inconsistencies in a way we didn't in other areas where we were able to deploy far more resources. We're confused about the resources. So that's the first problem with Syria. It illustrates very well because we've got a popular revolution going on by at least 60% of the Sunni population that is ever more dominated not just by Islamic groups who we question whether they're committed to democracy. We're questioning whether these people are committed to a rational world, the guys who are leading the charge, al-Nusra, the ISIS. The second reason why it's so important is not only its geographic location and in the tradition of the Umayyad Caliphate and such, but also the fact that there's 2 sets of issues going there. And this is Walter Russell Mead, not me talking at this point. But the way we've looked at things since 1989 is, okay, we've got human trafficking problems, we've got weapons of mass destruction problems, terrorism problems, lagging economy problems, and these kind of things, and we go in and try and deal with them each separately. In Syria, we may be facing a true geostrategic problem for the first time, limited exception in the coastal areas off of China, since the late 1980s, where we could see a de facto Russian, Syrian, Hezbollah, Iranian military victory in the middle of the Middle East. That's a game changer, I think. I could be wrong, but if we see that, and if that geostrategic situation is the way it is, that's the most important thing about Syria. Not getting the chemical weapons out, not taking care of the refugees, all of which are important, but they're not central as that might be. I say might be.
And do you agree that those are the stakes in Syria?
Yes, I think the stakes are very high, and I think anyone else in the administration would say the same thing. But I still don't see any other solution to what's going on there, and certainly the 4,500 or 5,000 foreign fighters, many of whom are bona fide jihadis now in Syria, is a huge issue. But there's no solution other than a political solution, and that's why Secretary Kerry and others have been so engaged in trying to formulate this Geneva II conference. There's no there are no illusions in the administration, which is sometimes the hint you get, is that people don't understand the stakes involved there. But the political solution is extraordinarily difficult to achieve, and again, we need to approach that with a lot of humility, but that's the only out.
But if the stakes are that high, and we're sort of betting everything on a political solution in which we're backing what appears to be the weakest of the three parties involved, doesn't that, I mean, how is that?
But again, you've got to look at the alternatives here. And again, I want to stress this chemical weapons deal has one, made the neighborhood safer, and two, removed the threat that could kill the most Syrians most rapidly. So that's not insignificant. And it, in my view, is certainly, and as Tony said this morning, certainly a preferable option to a military strike that would have had limited results. But you have to look at the alternative, and the goal is to preserve the territorial integrity of Syria and reach some kind of political solution. And of course, it's going to be extraordinarily hard.
Got it. Nora, I want to ask you one question, then I want to open it up to the audience. Nora, I want to talk about how, we talked before the session about how, so much of Arab media is actually repurposed American movies and TV overdubbed into Arabic, and how the image of Arab people in those movies is often stereotypical, evil terrorist with a mustache. And what does that? What does that do? That sort of importation of stereotypes, and what can you do to counter that? And what is your group doing to try to counter that?
Well, what we're trying to do is, number one, we're focusing on Arabic language, and that by default, it's when we talk media, we're talking films, applications, games, anything to do with content. And from that, we're doing it internally, locally, from within the UAE, which has more than 200 nationalities within. And then also doing it with partnership with either international entities. Let it be based in Los Angeles or in the UK or in Bollywood, wherever there are major pictures that are happening and we can collaborate with. But when we go to the moment, to the segment of the stereotypes or the misperception of Arabs in certain films, this is where we as Arabs, because we didn't have this powerful media movement, we didn't globalize our content. Our content is not globalized. It's very local. It's very regional. We watch our own content. Sometimes it's great. Sometimes it's not. And if it's not, we watch formats which are equivalent to American Idol, which is Arab Idol, The Voice. There's The Voice. And then there's this lack of how we can globalize our content. And from there, again, at the same time, collaborate in a way that we spread our culture and spread, how it's a very rich region. Okay, I mean, in one country there are different dialects, there are different ways of wearing their clothes, there's different ways of celebrating their weddings. We, as Arabs, maybe we don't know. For example, I don't know how are the rituals of let's say a Yemeni wedding, or a wedding in an area, in a rural area in Egypt. So. Because the media sector within the region wasn't developed, it stopped in the 80s. We stopped in the 80s, and we didn't develop in a way that will get us to be the Bollywoods or to be the Korean waves, from examples that went in a way that made people to understand the culture. So just to cut it short I mean, sometimes I watch, for example, Homeland, and it starts with an Arabic accent, which is I don't know from where, then it starts with a different accent, which is as if it's Arabic, and then with an Afghani accent, which is not Afghani, and you sit there and said, okay, just fine. I mean, he's a terrorist. We accept that, but just get the dialect right, get the accent right. And this is what we're trying. I mean, it's more of getting it right, let's say, and of us also, and with a collaborator. And when we look into opportunities, I wish in the future to see I mean, what are we doing right now after the changes within the region? How are we looking into the youth who are unemployed? You know, I know that there is a problem in education, and education is not in certain areas. It didn't reach to a way where it will make them maybe look into a better opportunity in a way that we would wish for. But where can we encourage the Silicon Valley in the region? Where can we encourage a mini Hollywood in the region? Where can we encourage gamers in the region? I mean, all of these segments, there are opportunities, but how we can collaborate and we can work together, because yet again, I'm going to repeat, 60% are below the age of 25. These are the people who are going to change the region in the future, and not what we're seeing in 5 or 10 years time.
Great, I'd like to open up to...
Okay. Great. But by the way, before we start, I do want to say, last year when we did this event, one of our global thinkers was on the panel. He was a guy from Google. And he said, I love coming to Washington. He said, because everybody from Washington only talks about problems. And I live in Silicon Valley, and all we do is talk about solutions. Now, admittedly, that was a bit of a self-serving, arrogant Silicon Valley view of the world. But the reality was there was a different perspective. And I get the impression, listening to Nora, and I'm very glad that throughout the day and to this evening, you'll get a chance to hear from more and more of our global thinkers, that there's another discussion altogether happening in the region, on the ground, that is not America-centric, that is not even politics or national security-centric. It's about finding the ways to get ahead, knit societies together, take advantage of cultural connections, use new media. And it's very important to hear both sides, because mostly in Washington, we talk about the other stuff, and that's with all respect to a great panel. Having said that, let me turn to another typical Washington white guy, Bob Horvath.
Thank you. I'll try to talk about a solution, or at least what I think might be a partial solution. I think Ann's analysis on the cause of this instability and the frustration with younger people not being able to get jobs, particularly educated kids, is really one of the root causes of all this. And I'd like to pair this with another issue that was discussed in the earlier panels, and that is there was a lot of emphasis on resource constraints, lack of resources, in part because of budgetary issues, in part because of sequestration. I'd like to focus on resource inflexibility, because it seems to me one of the opportunities we did have in the Middle East, whether it was a Muslim Brotherhood or a Ennahda leadership of the country, was programs that actually address the needs of younger people, educational programs, training programs, a whole range of programs. It was not the administration didn't want to do it. It was so damn hard to get money, not even new money, reprogrammed old money through the Congress with all the constraints and all of the bureaucratic hang-ups to get money transferred. So I would like to raise the question whether, when we develop, if we do a more strategic view of the region, something that responds to some of these concerns, we can have an opportunity with broader support to focus on ways of allowing for more resource flexibility. We had plenty of money when we wanted to bomb Libya. We couldn't get a few $100 million, or even smaller amounts, to reprogram money for Egypt or Tunisia or elsewhere to deal with the root cause of these problems. How do we address this kind of issue? What do we do over the next several years so we're not constrained when we want to move to address a problem and we're constrained by the old ways of doing things so we can't?
Absolutely. I mean, for instance, we have this debate about Egypt, and I presume about other countries. There are 3,000 Egyptians, slightly less actually, in school in this country, higher education. There are 77,000 Saudis because they're paying their own way. But that's an embarrassment. We should be sending Egyptians to MIT and Caltech. And we should also be doing a basic education. And we shouldn't have a debate about which we can afford. And frankly, we've done not a very good job on either one. for a lot of reasons, which Bob and others in this audience know well. But we not only need resources, and I think, which are very constrained, as we've discussed, and because of our own economic, we also need more flexibility in how rapidly and creatively we can employ the resources we've got. And we've become, in some respects, very stultified over the years.
Anybody else want to address that? Okay, so let's go over here. Mark.
Mark Katz from George Mason University. I'm based here in Washington, so I guess I'm not a global thinker. Anyway, I have a question for the gentleman who's avoiding dog duty today. I was surprised by your envisioning Syria as a possible geopolitical victory for Russia, Iran, Hezbollah. Certainly, just from reading the Russian press, it seems that they are impressed that the job is very, very difficult, their analysts say. And it strikes me that a country, Russia in particular, when it was a question of can they even hang on to Ukraine, can they really hope for victory in Syria? It strikes me that they can't do a Chechnya there. In other words, just get rid of all the opponents. They can't do what the Algerian government did. That the real prospect in Syria is just for war unending and perhaps spreading more than a geopolitical victory for Russia, Iran, etc. Thank you.
I'm not sure that will be the outcome, but it certainly could be an outcome. Let me tick off the concerns you raised, because I think they're good concerns, but I think they have answers. First of all, what the Syrian government, with Russian weapons, Hezbollah infantry, Iranian financing and advice is doing, puts the Algerians to shame when it comes to slaughtering a civilian population in order to win the civil war. And I think that I see no hesitation on the part of the Russian government to continue to support an extraordinarily vicious, violent, and horrific campaign, mainly aimed at civilians. Secondly, I think Russia's doing pretty good hanging on to the Ukraine. We all thought a few years ago, like for the last 20 years, that Ukraine was going to go into the European orbit, just like so many other countries in Eastern Europe. And it isn't looking that way today. And I think that that's a question of geopolitics and raw power, hard power, not just tanks, but gas, money, and somebody who's willing to deploy very quickly and very flexibly these elements of power, which we're not structured to do, achieving geostrategic victories.
If I may add, I actually think the geostrategic victory has already happened. It's not about the future. I agree with Jim. I mean, if you looked at it, the billing 2 years ago was that Assad was going to fall. It would be a strategic defeat for Iran, that the Russians were on the wrong side of history in the Middle East, that they were going to pay a heavy price in the region for their support of Assad. Fast forward to today, Assad's doing fine. He has the upper hand. The expectation is that he either will survive this. In the worst case is that he hasn't fallen. And ultimately, both the will of the people and the will of Europe and the United States on this has been defied. And the alliance that's keeping Assad together is proving itself to be resilient and sufficiently a factor in regional politics to be taken seriously by all in the region. I mean, you listen to the rhetoric of just, let's say, the Iranians on Syria is pretty self-confident and self-congratulatory. Assad and the war is a inconvenience to them. It is bleeding them financially. They wish it hadn't happened, but they don't feel like they're being defeated. In fact, they think they probably have rode out the worst of it, and that could be interpreted very easily as a strategic victory for them.
Vali, there's been a lot of talk here about are economic sanctions bringing Iran to the table. To what degree does Iran's strength in Syria and elsewhere in the region actually forced us to the table?
I don't think it forced us to the table, but it does impact their sense of whether they're really on their back heel or not.
Mm-hmm.
So it's
the kind of deal we might get.
Well, the deal is important in terms of, it depends on what the deal means, if there is a deal. Does the deal mean that the United States actually will become more engaged in the region and is willing to stay and sit in between Iran and its neighbors and make sure that the deal sticks, that Iran plays a positive role in the region? Or is this deal really is going to be interpreted by the United States and the region as a sort of a final act? We got this deal, Iran is no longer the threat that we thought, then we really can focus on Asia. And that would give Iran a much greater sense of freedom of action in the region. And it will also create much more instability among countries, particularly Iran's neighbors in the Gulf, who for at least the past 30 years have looked at the United States to be the balancer and the container of Iran. So I think we are not paying much attention right now as to how do we explain what happens after we do it to the region. And that's a very important issue because psychologically for Iranians and their neighbors, genuinely the big shift, the big game change will come if there is a deal and what happens the day after.
Okay, we have one more question back here.
My name is Nadia Bilbisi. I'm a reporter with Al Arabiya Television. My question is for Noura. I met a Tunisian guy recently, and he told me that the average age of a person who died during the Arab Spring is 27. And the average age of a person who represents him or her in parliament now is 70-year-old. You talked about the young people in the Middle East, and I agree with you. I think the future is with young people and women. But how do you move them from being an activist who willing to risk their lives to being a decision makers? And especially in the Gulf, where most of the connection, as we all know, depends on families. So how do you give these young people a voice, not just economically, but also politically?
Well, going back from how we give them a voice is, of course, there is a powerful tool right now which is called the social network. And so how do you deploy social networks in terms of understanding their needs, especially the youth? And from there also looking into the mobile penetration within the region. It's a high mobile penetration and it's a connected region. And if not, I mean, the usage of Facebook and the Twitter likes is something that makes you, let's say, gauge the level of, I don't know, anger, sometimes the gauge of happiness, or the gauge of requests, or, it's just how you analyze what you're doing, whether you're in a position with the media sector or parliament sector. I am in the parliament in my country, and what we do is we look into the social networks, and we look into the request and analyze it in a weekly basis and in a daily basis. I would like to also to highlight that last week, our Prime Minister, who's also the Vice President, he started a brainstorming session on Twitter regarding education and health reform and ideas. We received more than 82,000 ideas on Twitter. That's not on email or on the website. And what happened is they're working on how to engage the youth and the people in the field to be part of getting a better education and health system, let's say, within the country. Looking at the youth in different countries, in Tunisia or in Egypt or in Syria, this is where we get requests in terms of grants, short films, games, applications. But from there, it's not just a grant and that's it. It's looking at the business model and getting the venture capitalist within Egypt or Tunisia or somewhere else in Abu Dhabi or in Dubai. How can we support, or the banks as well, how we can support such businesses? We are indirectly helping them with the connections and getting their voices out and the opportunities. I mean, the key is providing the opportunity. If the opportunity is there in the region, from employment, from their managing their own business, or getting their voice heard in a parliament, from utilizing the technology, or in a different form, it depends where you are. This is the key to listen and get them part of what you're doing. I hope in Tunisia they will start getting a students' parliaments or things that are happening in different places. In my country, we have a students' parliament that gets students and get them as if they're in a parliament, debate and discuss certain issues. So there are many ways. In weekends within back in Abu Dhabi, the youth, or let's say the young guys, they will enjoy going to shopping malls, watching a movie, or doing whatever they enjoy doing. What we try to do is we create those magnets and spaces, collaboration spaces, where they can program or code their own games, and also film their upcoming film or develop a new application. And from there, it's just providing them with a platform. Even if that platform, not necessarily a platform that will get them a commercial income. It's how the key is analyze what you have, analyze your demographics, understand the youth, and get the right people to to listen to them and also to implement what we can offer instead of just having this gap between the decision makers and the youth themselves.
I should add that, I don't want to minimize the challenges involved in your question, but one of the ways that one senses these things will change is evidenced by the fact that you, a reporter from Al Arabiya, stood up, a woman, and asked the question to a woman who's the CEO of a significant company in Abu Dhabi, is also a member of the parliament, and is clearly a leader in that country. So there are signs of some progress and some change that help address that. Other questions for this group? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Tamara Chalabi, and I'm a global thinker. I wanted to thank you all, also to concur that I agree with Noura about the homeland dialects and actually gibberish Arabic.
I know.
What I have two questions actually. One is specifically to the media, and I think what you're doing is great. But overall, when you look at the general, let's say TV, radio, press-based media in the Middle East, it tends to be controlled by a few number of countries who are not necessarily very democratically driven. And ultimately, when you talk about creating opportunities and letting people express themselves, there's a point at which freedom of expression comes into play. And the issue of democracy and democratization becomes a real one, and even potentially life-threatening, because if you, let's say, want to express yourself as an atheist or as a whatever, it's not possible. So there's a lot of self-censorship that goes on, particularly when you're dealing with culture. So I just wanted to know how you think this can be overcome. And the second question is to Professor Nasser. Do you think that Iran will be a potential partner for fighting Al-Qaeda realistically for the US for lack of other options?
I'll answer my part. I mean, going through the point of expression and how we engage the youth with the content. There's the dimension of, I don't know if you attended any regional film festivals within the region. And the beautiful thing that you see is that what they're tapping into, let's say maybe what we call taboo topics that you can see within festivals. Festivals within Abu Dhabi, within Dubai, within Egypt, within other places. And this is where we're trying our best to enrich that film festival, that it can be a platform for such expression or problems. Let it be, 10 years ago, we won't dare watch it on our TV channels. I think the core, Tamara, is our media industry. I mean, we are used to channels that are public service channels. And from a creativity point of view, it's controlled in a way that it's self-censored in any public sector that won't allow people to show or express their feelings in a way that, that we see in different mediums. Currently, with what's happening with the social network and with the globalized content, this is where you can get kids who are different in the way that they express themselves and their religions. So if the atheist, 2 weeks ago there was an atheist on an Egyptian TV channel. He was bashed, unfortunately. It wasn't a way to understand why is he an atheist. It was a way to attack him, where it's supposed to be different. I mean, religion is personal, and if he's an atheist, just try to understand why is he an atheist. That's it in terms of kicking him out. But this is where you're seeing with the development of content, and specifically the youth, they're beginning to express what they're expressing. Yet again, we always have this framework of certain content that unfortunately won't help develop the sector. So from there, I think there are many dimensions that are helping our content to be enriched, and especially with what's happening in the festivals and with the issues around the region. I think we're seeing more difference. If I say 5 years ago, currently the film festivals can show you, topics that we didn't see before.
I think the place that this might be a test as to whether there will be cooperation over Al-Qaeda will be Syria, but that won't be between Iran and the United States. It's actually much more broadly whether it be between the United States and Europe, and that axis of Russia, and Iran, and ultimately how are they going to deal with the extremist forces in Syria. But going back a bit, usually the case had been that Iran proved sometimes mildly supportive on fight against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda as a way of trying to move things further with the United States on the nuclear issue. What is different this time is actually that both sides have decided that they really don't want to deal with any other issue first until the nuclear deal is sorted out. And so if there is a positive path forward, then there's all sorts of other things they can talk about. And if there is no deal, if the deal gets blocked, I think it'd be very difficult for them immediately to be cooperating on anything else.
Okay. Do we have other questions here? Yes, ma'am. I'll go back here and then I'll go up to you, Jim. We've got just about 12 minutes left, so that should guide the length of the questions. I don't know how you can work Canada into this, but go ahead.
We're speaking about upheavals here. I don't know more is they call it a revolution, and it's been described similar to the civil rights movement. And currently, the Indigenous people in Canada are seeking their own liberation and freedom from the Indian Act and all the oppression that Canada is perpetuating. So I'm relating to your statement about women and seeing that the women are beginning to have a visible stand in terms of hopefully the global community. But the challenge here I'm seeing even here is the white privilege and the male privilege that seems to be dominating even the conversations. So I am concerned that a lot of the discussion has not even brought into play the violations of human rights of Indigenous people globally. And when we speak about that, I would hope that all of you would talk about those things that are happening in your own communities. And I can relate to how this discussion could take that into consideration as well. So my question to you is, this young lady and I can't pronounce your name, I'm sorry. When you talk about the youth in your discussions, what do you see social media playing a role in it? You mentioned Twitter and Facebook. What else do you see that would work?
I mean, it's when you look into the majority and you look into the future of where you live, or I mean, the place you work in. I mean, it's important to look into. I mean, how are you preparing for what's next? And when we look into the social networks, Medium is just an example. So, I mean, it's not just the social networks. The roadshows that we do around schools is how we go to schools and understand, you know, where do they want to go next, and educate them about the importance of creating their own content, because it has to reflect their own culture. And the culture is an evolving culture. I mean, we're living in a country with more than 200 nationalities. And again, at the same time, that means it equals tolerance. And it equals that the culture is evolving, and it equals that we are required to form it in a way that will help them form it, number one. And number two is also understanding what is next for them. So the reason we're looking into the youth and making sure that, you know, there's this platform for them is because we deeply believe that it's how you're securing the future, and you don't want to end up with the time phase where the youth, they don't know what's the opportunity. They need to understand the opportunity while they're in school. They need to understand it while they're, I don't know, drawing their next sketch or whatever it is. We need to make sure that there is an opportunity for the kids from school, and then when they graduate, what is next. So it's understanding, you know, that, you know, the phases that they go through, and from there also cultivate what you can build upon that.
Can I add just one thing to the importance of the social media, and particularly engagement of youth, is that it's also really an important solution to the economic problems of the region. because that kind of technology, mobile technology, social networks, presents the best opportunity to create a region-wide economic platform that would allow, bringing particularly the classes that are not included in the economy. For instance, using mobile phones to do banking, to do microfinance, reach into communities that otherwise the regular economy, given the constraints that has been mentioned, cannot get into. So it's really an economic issue, just above and beyond a social and political issue in the region.
Hi, Jim Traub from Foreign Policy. I'm very struck that we've spent hours here today talking about the Middle East, and nobody has even mentioned Israel-Palestine. So it was a convention of thinking here a few years ago that the solution of the Israel-Palestine problem was the key that would unlock the Middle East more broadly. So what I'd like to ask is not so much are we going to solve the problem as has it become the case that Israel-Palestine has become like Cyprus or like Kashmir, which is it's a kind of intractable problem that we know we're not going to solve, and it just doesn't really influence that much that in some sense it's become marginal to more important calculations?
Well, I'll take an unofficial view of that, but in reality, it is a problem. It's still a problem, and it's going to be a problem going forward. But right now, it's not the most acute problem in the region. It's not the problem that's deciding the geostrategy of the region. So it is a festering problem. At some, we will have. It is right for us. It's right for Secretary Kerry to be focusing on it, and it's very good if we make any kind of progress on it. But right now, as I said, the future of that region is being written in Syria, to some extent in this discussion of Iran. And when you have a country the size of Egypt, its future somewhat open to question, that really is much more important. So in terms of what it is that's going to be deciding the future and decide American interests, it's not the Arab-Israeli issue at this point in time. It's these other more important issues.
Let me take a. Jim, ask the Secretary when he comes about that, because one, I think he would argue that it will be absolutely instrumental, and two, that he thinks it can be done. But I mean, I agree with Valley that it's certainly not the most urgent problem that we face now in the Middle East, but it's one that could have enormous long-term consequences just in Egypt. I mean, imagine what would take place in Egypt in terms of the security situation if you could solve the problems in Gaza, on their border, and in the Sinai, and the spillover effect, what would happen in Jordan, what would happen in Lebanon. So I think it would have enormous long-range implications. And again, ask the Secretary about it, but it isn't the most urgent issue that we face right now.
Where it is urgent, though, and it's something that we live with all of the time, because the conventional, not for public attribution wisdom of those of us who worked on the issue is that despite what a lot of people in the region say, it's not the most important issue. It's not what they talk to our top leaders behind closed doors about. What it does impact, though, is the ability of the United States to deploy our power, I hate to use the word, but our soft power, our persuasive abilities, our sense of right and wrong to the region, to populations, getting to the question of indigenous groups and everything, as long as that is out there, totally apart from its significant impact, as Ann said, on the region itself, it has a huge impact on how the Arab populations and the Muslim populations of the region and beyond see the United States and see us as a honest broker. So to the extent that we can make progress on it, it's a good thing.
And it's a distraction in all kinds of ways, like at the United Nations. You have no idea how much time our delegations spend up there in various groups, fighting back these resolutions and these discussions, and how it spills over into the American perception of the entire UN system. That would be worth resolving. That would be an enormous thing to resolve in terms of enhancing the ability of the United Nations to partner with us on the strategic interests.
And yet that alliance and the alliance with the Saudis and and with the Egyptians for decades formed the sort of underpinnings of our policies in the region. And two of those three countries seem to be very displeased with how we're interacting over there right now, and the third is kind of in flames. And so how do we sort of go, reach out to Iran and try to figure out Syria without pissing off our most important allies in the region?
I'll take a stab at that. It's not the substance of the Iranian agreement. We heard very good descriptions of it. We'll probably hear another one later. The president was good over the weekend on why this is a good idea. It's exactly what people were talking about in earlier attempts, and nobody raised any real objections to it. We just didn't think we could get it. Well, damn it, we got it. The problem is it's the environment within which this has happened. Not the CW agreement, but the fact that at the last moment, rather than bomb Syria, we decided to go to a Congress which was set up to fail, and immediately had a huge reaction against any use of military force anywhere in the region. It's little things like, for a couple of $100 million in reacting to the sequester, we pulled an aircraft carrier out of the region some time ago. And it's a dozen other things that make our partners in the region, again, behind closed doors, doubt whether we're willing to maintain this strategic containment strategy, containment not just against the Iranians, but containment against all of the bad guys that keep popping up in the region. And that's something that the administration has to deal with in some way, not by not doing the Iranian thing. The Iranian thing in the end can be a good thing, but by reassuring people. And the president and the secretary say this all the time. But it requires actions on the ground at this point. It really does.
And those sound like legit critiques.
Yeah, they're totally, I mean, look, we have long-standing alliances with the countries of the Gulf, and Valley's right, enormous commercial relationships that are only going to prosper over time. And I do think there's been a lack of consultation and a lack of discussion, and I think the Secretary and the President have tried to redress this. The Secretary's been to the Gulf several times. He certainly has almost daily phone contact with some of our allies in the Gulf. So I think reassurance is necessary and close consultation going forward, and I think that's underway.
I would say, you know, ultimately, the United States has been the balancer in this region for the better part of 3 decades. It's been the country that has prevented more wars, more instability. And one thing we haven't done in this time period is really to create any viable regional structures. So there is nothing there that would say that we operate through a sort of a system of alliances with regional powers that would give a certain stability at a time when you have a shift, as is happening in Syria or in the Gulf. We have bilateral relationships, and they are obviously subject to a change of opinion on our side. And the signaling we've been giving in the past 5 years have not been reassuring that we're willing to necessarily stand by them in the way that we have in the past. And I think it's not about reassuring about Iran. That's important, but it's also important about reassuring them about our own commitment to the region.
Thank you very much. Let me, before we, is this on? Let me, before we wrap up and thank them and move on to the next panel, I want to say one thing because it resonated with me, and I do this with a little hesitation because it's a little risky to do. But the comment earlier about what I think the term was white male privilege struck close to home. Part of what we're trying to do at foreign policy is broaden the definition of foreign policy. We're trying to cover it more broadly. We talk about the big tent vision of foreign policy. So it's not just about conflicts, it's also about drivers of growth. So we talk about economic drivers or technological drivers of growth. We talk about energy. We want to broaden those things. We've added an energy channel on our website. We've added a peace channel on our website to talk about development. We want to talk about conflict resolution instead of just conflict, which is sort of easy and kind of the way a lot of foreign policy gets covered. But there's another definition of the big tent of foreign policy, and that is voices that are reflective of the people who are driving change in the world. And for the most part, the foreign policy establishment in the United States has been white and male and East Coast and from certain places. And it has been slow to change. One of the things that we want to do is help accelerate that change and search for new voices. And as you look at foreign policy over the course of the next year, one thing I can tell you, you will see more voices from different parts of the world. You will see more voices that are women. You will see more voices of diversity, because you can't tell the story of the world from the perspective of a very narrow slice of the world. We are not where we need to be on that. And making that change is a big priority for us. So I'm glad you brought it up, and frankly, what we do at the Global Thinkers is a reflection of that. We are seeking out new voices systematically and trying to broaden the dimensions to the conversation. In any event, I'm sorry to get on the soapbox here and talk about something like that, and clearly we've got a couple of women on this panel who are blazing trails, and I think that's extremely important. And you will see more during the course of today, because we are in the midst of this effort. It's not just something that's crossing our mind at the moment. Having said that, we're going to move to a panel focusing on a different set of issues, those associated with Europe in a broader sense and transatlantic issues. Before we do that, and Fred and Miriam, and by the way, Deb, I've recruited Bob Hormats to be on this panel. So, leave an extra chair, because we couldn't keep him out. We've discovered that as the day's conversation goes by, he's in it whether we want him in it or not. So we're going to put him up on the stage and see if that works. But in any event, we're going to sort of carry on that shift. Before we begin that shift, I'd like you to join me in thanking the panelists for doing a terrific job.